It was a crisp November evening when David Saunders, a traveling salesman, found himself driving down Route 7 in rural Vermont. The winding roads, flanked by dense forests, were beautiful by day but took on a haunting quality at night. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, and the only sound was the crunch of fallen leaves under his tires. David had been on the road for hours, his eyes tired from squinting at the poorly lit road. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard. 11:47 p.m. The nearest town was still miles away, and he was beginning to regret not stopping earlier to rest. As he rounded a particularly sharp bend, his headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside. It was a young woman, her long hair flowing in the breeze, wearing a white dress that seemed out of place for the chilly weather. She had one hand raised, her thumb out, signaling for a ride. David hesitated for a moment. Hitchhikers were a rarity on these roads, especially this late at night. But something about her seemed desperate, and he couldn't bring himself to drive past her. He slowed down and pulled over, rolling down the passenger side window. "Need a ride?" David asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman nodded silently and opened the door, slipping into the passenger seat. She didn't say a word, just stared straight ahead, her pale face illuminated by the dashboard light. David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he chalked it up to fatigue. "Where are you headed?" he asked, hoping to break the uneasy silence. "Just up ahead," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded and continued driving, but the tension in the car was palpable. He glanced at her occasionally, noticing how still she sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her dress, he realized, was wet, dark stains seeping through the fabric. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. They drove in silence for several miles. The woman never spoke again, never moved. David's unease grew with each passing minute. Finally, they reached a small, desolate stretch of road, bordered by an old cemetery. "Here," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence like a gunshot. David pulled over, confused. There were no houses or signs of civilization, just the cemetery and the surrounding woods. The woman opened the door and stepped out, her bare feet silent on the cold pavement. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer now, almost like an echo. David watched as she walked toward the cemetery, her figure disappearing into the shadows. A sense of dread washed over him, and he quickly turned the car around, eager to get away from this unsettling place. He drove for a few more minutes, trying to shake the eerie feeling that had settled in his bones. Just as he was about to turn onto the main road, he saw something that made his blood run cold. On the passenger seat where the woman had sat was a damp patch, dark and red blood. David slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to be imagining it. He wiped at the stain, but it wouldn't come off. In a panic, he looked back down the road where he had dropped her off, but there was no sign of her. Determined to get to the bottom of this, David turned the car around and drove back to the cemetery. He parked at the edge and got out, his breath visible in the cold night air. He walked slowly through the gates, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The cemetery was old, the headstones weathered and covered in moss. As he walked deeper into the graveyard, something caught his eye. A fresh grave, the earth still loose. And there on the tombstone was the woman's name, Emily Harper. The date of death was carved into the stone, *** November 11th, 1998 ***. Today's date. David stumbled back, his mind racing. He had given a ride to a ghost, a woman who had died that very night. The blood in his car, the wet stains on her dress. It all made horrifying sense now. He ran back to his car and sped away, his heart pounding in his chest. He never told anyone about that night, but he never took Route 7 again, either. Every year on November 11th, he thinks of Emily Harper and wonders if anyone else has seen the phantom hitchhiker of Route 7. It was a cold, foggy night in November when Lisa decided to take the long drive back to her hometown. She had been visiting a friend in a small town several hours away, and with the night creeping in faster than she expected, she figured it was best to leave before it got too late. The narrow, winding roads were treacherous in the dark, and the dense fog rolling in only made it worse. Lisa was an experienced driver, but even she felt uneasy as her car's headlights struggled to cut through the mist. The road seemed endless, the trees on either side looming like dark, faceless sentinels. There was no one else on the road, and the isolation gnawed at her nerves. After an hour of tense driving, she noticed a figure up ahead on the side of the road. It was a man, standing by a broken-down car, his thumb outstretched in the universal gesture for a ride. Lisa hesitated. She'd heard stories about hitchhikers, the kind that made her wary, but something about this man seemed desperate, almost pitiful. Against her better judgment, she slowed down and pulled over. The man approached the car, his face shadowed by the hood of his jacket. "Thank you so much," he said, his voice a bit raspy. "My car broke down, and there's no cell service out here. Could you give me a lift to the next town?" Lisa nodded, unlocking the passenger door. "Sure, it's not far from here. Hop in." The man slid into the seat beside her, and as they drove off, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man was quiet, too quiet. He barely said a word as they drove, his eyes fixed straight ahead. After a few minutes of silence, Lisa tried to make conversation. "So, where exactly are you headed?" "Just down the road a bit," he replied curtly. His tone was cold, devoid of any warmth or gratitude. The unease in Lisa's stomach grew. They drove for another 15 minutes when the man suddenly pointed to a small dirt road leading into the woods. "Turn here," he instructed. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. The road was barely visible, a narrow, unlit path leading into the darkness. "Are you sure this is the right way?" "Yes," the man insisted, his voice now carrying an edge of impatience. "Just turn." Every instinct in Lisa's body screamed at her to keep driving, but she found herself turning the wheel, guiding the car onto the dirt road. The trees closed in around them, their branches clawing at the car as they drove deeper into the woods. The fog grew thicker, and the darkness seemed to swallow them whole. "Stop here," the man suddenly demanded. Lisa brought the car to a halt, her heart pounding in her chest. The man turned to face her, and for the first time she got a good look at his face. His eyes were empty, devoid of any life or emotion. A sinister smile crept across his lips. "You made a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Lisa could react, the man lunged at her, his hands wrapping around her throat with a terrifying strength. She struggled, her vision blurring as she gasped for air. The world around her began to fade, the darkness closing in. But just as her vision dimmed, she heard it, a distant, echoing sound. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. It was the sound of a car engine, headlights cutting through the fog as another vehicle approached. The man suddenly released her, his eyes wide with fear. He glanced out the window, then back at Lisa, his expression one of panic. Without a word, he threw open the door and fled into the woods, disappearing into the night. Lisa gasped for breath, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the car keys. The other vehicle came to a stop beside her, and a concerned face appeared at her window. It was a woman, her expression one of worry. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice full of concern. Lisa nodded, still shaken. I think so. That man," the woman said, glancing into the woods. "He's been spotted on this road before. There are rumors about him. People who've picked him up have never been seen again." Lisa's blood ran cold. She didn't wait for the woman to say anything more. She quickly thanked her, started her car, and sped away, the road back to civilization feeling like a lifeline. When she finally reached the next town, she pulled into a gas station and called the police. They searched the woods, but the man was never found. Lisa never drove that road alone at night again, and she never picked up another hitchhiker. But the memory of that night, of the man with the empty eyes and sinister smile, haunted her dreams for years to come. And every time she drove at night, she couldn't help but glance into the shadows, wondering if he was still out there, waiting for his next unsuspecting victim. Though this story is a work of fiction, it's inspired by the countless unsettling tales of people encountering danger on lonely roads at night. Always trust your instincts when driving alone, especially when the night is as dark as the intentions of those who might cross your path. After a long, grueling night of work that stretched into the early hours of the morning, I finally clocked out and hit the road. It was that eerie time just before dawn, where the world still sleeps and the darkness clings to the edges of the horizon. The highway was almost empty, a quiet and serene stretch of pavement, offering a strange sense of peace after such a tiring day. About 30 minutes into my drive, I noticed a car in my rearview mirror. Its headlights were bright, and it was coming up fast, too fast. At first, I thought it was just another weary traveler like me, eager to get home. But as the vehicle hurtled closer, I realized something was off. The driver was speeding, easily going 20 miles over the limit, and closing the gap between us at an alarming rate. I stayed in the right lane, expecting the driver to pass me. But instead of overtaking, The car surged dangerously close to my rear bumper, almost colliding with my car before violently swerving to the side. For a brief moment, we were side by side, and when I glanced over, I saw the driver glaring at me, his face twisted in rage. He flipped me off, screaming something unintelligible, but the music in my car drowned out his words. Surprisingly, his actions ignited a fire of anger within me. Who did this guy think he was, cutting me off like that and then flipping me off? After the exhausting day I had, this was the last thing I needed. I honked at him, more out of frustration than anything else, but that only seemed to fuel his rage. He honked back, flipped me off again, and then floored it, speeding away even faster. I was relieved to see him disappear into the distance, but the relief was short-lived. Not even a minute later, I saw him again up ahead. His speed had dropped significantly, and I was closing in on him. For a moment, a wild idea crossed my mind. Maybe I should pass him and return the gesture. But as I approached, a gut feeling told me something was very wrong. The man seemed to be intentionally slowing down, almost as if he was waiting for me. The thought of what he might do if I tried to pass him chilled me to the bone. Was he dangerous? Was he planning something? My instincts screamed at me to get away, so when I saw an exit coming up, I took it without hesitation. I veered off the highway, too quickly for him to follow, and pulled over just to catch my breath and ensure he was really gone. After a few minutes, I merged back onto the highway, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me like a shadow. But the tension returned when I saw flashing lights in the distance. Police cars, sirens blaring, speeding past me. I kept driving, my nerves frayed, hoping they were after someone else. Anyone else but that man. The rest of the drive home was uneventful, but sleep eluded me that morning. I couldn't stop thinking about that driver, wondering what could have happened if I had passed him, if I had taken the bait. The next day, I found out the truth. The man who had nearly run me off the road had been caught by the police after a high-speed chase. He had been wanted for murder, having killed someone earlier that night. The realization hit me like a cold wave. If I had passed him, if I had given in to my anger, who knows what might have happened? What if he had been planning to do something to me? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, a stark reminder of how close I had come to something truly terrifying.